Welcome to Movie Speeching. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take good care. Today, I'll show you the 2016 thriller The Accountant. A couple visits an autistic center with their son Chris in the hopes of gaining some understanding. They explain that this is because the husband is in the military. The director offers to let Chris reside there. Chris chants nursery rhymes to himself as he works on a puzzle. He gets down to the last piece, but can't find it and starts having a meltdown. A young girl finds the missing piece and gives it to him, and he calms down. In the waiting area in the present, Chris works as an accountant. He sits in his office with a couple who are having financial difficulties and coaches them in all the ways to file their taxes. They are very appreciative, and the husband offers to let Chris come practice shooting on their property whenever he wants. The director of the United States Treasury, a man by the name of King, calls an analyst named Medina into his office to talk to her. He praises her accomplishments and asks why she hasn't moved on to higher things. She claims that she enjoys being an analyst alone, but he accuses her of lying. He shows her arrest records from her youth and informs her that it is illegal to lie on a federal job application. He claims that her record should have disqualified her from getting the job, and he demands that she work on a special project for him if she wants to keep it. King tells Medina he wants her to identify this man and solve the case by the end of the month or she will lose her job. He shows her pictures of a man known as the accountant and all the criminals he works with. He helps them keep track of their illegal money and has also been known to take lives. Chris arrives home and prepares dinner for himself before going to bed. He then puts on strong metal music, switches on the strobe lights, and uses a wooden rod to violently massage his shins. Chris then takes his prescription and goes to bed. He returns to his client's property later to practice shooting, and the man is really impressed by how excellent a shot Chris is. He travels to his storage unit where he keeps his caravan and has highly costly artifacts and paintings and all types of money in different currencies inside. He also has a sizable collection of weaponry. He reclines on his bed and has a flashback to his time in jail when his cellmate served as a mentor, teaching him various social skills and preparing him for his job managing money for dangerous criminals. Chris answers his phone when it rings in the morning, and a British woman who obviously works for him gives him some advice about finding some regular clientele. When she notices that others are beginning to have doubts about him, he reluctantly agrees to take on a typical client and enters a meeting with his new clients, a robotics prosthetics company. One of their internal auditors discovered that someone within the company is stealing money from their profits, and they want to hire Chris to investigate what's going on. Chris accepts the position and promises to start the following morning. Medina scans the photos she possesses and enlarges one so that the accountant's face is partially visible. She then crops the image and sends it to the face mapping department for study. Brax, a menacing guy hired to investigate business people for money laundering, enters a guy's car in a Swiss parking garage before he can drive away, places a gun to his head, and demands that he stop stealing other firms' money. Brax must beat the man until he complies, at which point it is time to go. Chris enters the office's conference room, where he is now permitted to work, and discovers a woman dozing off at the desk. She introduces herself as Dana, the person who initially discovered that money was missing, and apologizes for the difficult wake-up call. She gives him an overview of the problem and presumes that they would be working together, but Chris makes it plain that he likes to work alone. Chris begins working as a news conference is underway after she exits the conference room. Homeland Security calls Medina about the face recognition request they've discovered in an audio tape from one of his assaults, where a guy begs for his life just before the accountant murders him. At lunch, Dana sits next to Chris and tries to strike up a conversation after they transmit the audio file to Medina. Chris attempts to interact with others as much as he can, but it is obvious that he struggles. Chris returns to the conference room and works on the given whiteboard so diligently that he needs to continue on the adjacent windows. He fills the entire room with his work until he makes an important discovery. When Medina plays the audio clip repeatedly at home and uses her technology to isolate the accountant's voice, she can hear him humming a nursery rhyme to himself. Dana talks about her father and how he is the reason she chose to study accounting. Chris shows Dana his work in the conference room and tells her that he's identified a leak in the money someone is routing money to a company that doesn't exist. One of the company's shareholders interrupts them and asks Chris for results. Chris replies that he doesn't have a definitive answer yet and that he needs more time before he can say for sure who is taking the money. When Brax pays a visit to one of the robotics company's stockholders in the middle of the night, he instructs him to fetch the insulin out of the fridge and bring it to the table, and that he has two options. He can either inject himself with the insulin and make his death appear to be a suicide so that his wife can collect on his life insurance policy, or he can fight back and Brax will kill both him and his wife. The man decides to inject himself when Chris enters the conference room the following day, while custodians are inside erasing his work from the windows. The firm owner enters and requests that Chris cease working on the case after telling them to stop. Chris is disappointed that he wasn't able to complete what he had begun since his closest buddy, a stockholder, committed suicide last night due to guilt about taking money from the business. Chris returns home and spends a lot of time using his wooden rod to beat himself in the shins while listening to heavy metal music and turning on the strobe lights. He also tosses his medication and breaks the rod over his shin after a flashback of his mother leaving the family. He settles down, takes his medication, and goes to bed. The next morning, when he leaves the home, an automobile pursues him. Chris visits his client's property to practice shooting again, but whilst he is there, he gets a flashback to when he was younger and he and his brother Brax were fighting with a trainer that his father had hired. The trainer beat them, and they were covered in cuts and bruises. The trainer wants to end the session for the day, but the boys' father says they haven't had enough, so he forces the boys to get up and continue fighting inside the house. The two clients are being held hostage by two thugs, who demand that the wife go outside to call Chris in so they can get to him. When one thug leads her to the front door, Chris shoots him from the yard. When the other thug forces the couple into their truck and drives them away from there. The man says he doesn't know who is in charge, just that he was told to kill Chris and Dana. Chris strangles the man with his belt and demands to know who he is working for. The man replies that he doesn't know who is in charge. Chris kills the man, and when Dana arrives at her apartment, a man follows Dana to her apartment complex, and Chris arrives just in time to see him get into the lift with her. Chris sneaks into the back of the building and climbs the stairs. Two delivery guys approach her and claim to bring a box for her. They attempt to take her down, but she fights them off and flees to the toilet. Chris enters the flat, murders the two men, and invites Dana to accompany him. Chris takes Dana to his caravan and instructs her to wait outside while she gets ready. Dana enters inside nonetheless and notices all of his money and weaponry. She confronts him about them, but he is unable to provide her with any straight answers. When Medina receives a call from language services regarding the audio file she provided them, they inform her that the guy may have been the victim of abuse as a youngster or may have a neurological condition that causes him to recite the nursery rhyme under stress. Medina visits the IRS offices and collaborates with a worker to attempt to match the accountant's aliases with those who have significant salaries. Dana quizzes Chris about his fighting skills as they both hide out at a posh hotel. He explains to her that his father served in the military and trained him to defend himself against bullies. He also informs her that he has autism and finds it difficult to interact with others, despite his desire to do so. Dana tells him a tale about a dress she truly desired in high school and how she had to learn card counting and gambling in order to afford it. She only used it once, but the only reason she wanted it was to attempt to blend in with the other kids. Dana goes in to kiss him as the two have an emotional moment, but Chris pulls away after learning something about the robotics case. He explains to her that someone was taking money from the business and reinvesting it to increase profits. Later, Chris pursues Brax along the street. When Brax sees him and fires at him, Chris keeps going. He eventually ends up at one of the shareholders' hotel rooms, where he discovers that she has been murdered. Medina calls King with this information, and she tells him that most of the money that Chris makes is donated to neuroscience organizations when Chris returns to the hotel. Medina works with the employee at the IRS office and is able to find out the accountant's real name is Chris and that he works as an accountant at a small firm in a building connected to a bunch of cash businesses that he owns and runs his money through to hide how much he's actually making. Chris discovers Dana dozing off on the couch and has a flashback of his father making him and his brother beat up a group of kids who had bullied him at school earlier that day. Deciding it's too risky to keep Dana involved, Chris packs up his belongings and departs. King and Medina guide a team of investigators through Chris's home and they take note of all of his peculiar living customs. They discover that he has a lot of weapons without serial numbers on them. The owner of the robots firm hires Brax to install security cameras in his home as part of an extremely sophisticated security system in case Chris attempts to find him. Medina tells King that she tried to murder a drug dealer who was supplying drugs to her sister and that she doesn't regret her actions. King dismisses the other investigators, but he and Medina remain in the home to chat. He wants Medina to tell him about the facts of her arrest. King informs Medina of his efforts to find the accountant's whereabouts and for how long. He informs her about the struggles he had to go through to get to this point, including how he was there at the hotel where Chris' audio was captured and how he overheard him killing the guy, after which Chris held him at gunpoint and asked him if he was a good parent. When King responded in the affirmative, Chris released him. He accepted Chris, sparing his life, as an assignment to quit. When he was going to leave his job permanently after saving Chris' life, he received a call from a lady with a British accent who had information about an impending illicit transaction. He then made the decision to continue on the force by using the woman who had called as an informant. King spoke with the government informant who shared Chris's cell with him. When the people he used to work for discovered Chris after he was released from prison for aiding criminals with their money, tortured him, and eventually killed him. When one of the guards informed Chris of his cellmate's death, Chris freaked out and escaped the prison. He later attended his mother's funeral with his father, but when they were asked to leave, they left. Chris lost his cool. Chris was being fired at by a security guard, but his father dodged the bullet and perished. When Medina asks King why he is telling her all of this, he responds that he wants Medina to take over as the British woman's phone answerer when he retires in 7 months. Medina answers the phone at Chris's house. When it calls, a British woman is on the other end of the line and she provides Medina with information about the robotics firm. When Chris enters the property while Brax is in the home of the firm owner, Brax sends out several of his men, and Chris murders all save one of them to question about the design of the house. From the surveillance cameras, Brax watches as he sends his guys to Chris and attempts to give them instructions on how to take him out. While Brax checks the surveillance footage and recognizes Chris as his brother, he orders his men to stand down after Chris manages to kill every guy Brax sends his way and enter the home despite his wounded. When Brax visits Chris, the business owner takes a seat in front of the cameras. At first, Brax is upset with Chris for not returning his calls for more than 10 years and for attending their mother's funeral. Brax also accuses Chris of being responsible for their father's death, and Chris allows Brax to hit him to let out some of his anger. The two brothers are in charge of the situation as Chris keeps Brax at gunpoint until he calms down. When the company owner enters the room, bewildered and angry that Brax hasn't taken care of Chris, Chris shoots him and picks up the conversation with his brother. Chris pledges to hook up with Brax in a week before he departs so that they may talk before he leaves. Another family comes to the Neuroscience Center for guidance with their autistic kid. As their kid explores the space, he encounters Justine, the director's daughter, who he recognizes as the little girl who assisted Chris with his puzzle when he was a youngster. When Justine displays how she interacts, the director reveals that she is nonverbal but uses a highly high-tech laptop. The voice the computer produces is the same British woman who works with Chris Dana. Justine then returns to her flat to tidy up and receives a delivery. When she opens it, she expects to discover a classic painting, but upon closer examination, she realizes that the outside canvas is only masking what is within. She tears the outer layer off to show a pricey artwork that she recognizes from Chris's trailer. Thank you for watching. See you on the next video.